Jonathan isn't speaking today, and thanks. And he left me with the easy part of the Sermon on the Mount: adultery, divorce, lust, and bodily mutilation. Yeah. It's not easy talking about sex in situations like this at church. I grew up a Baptist in the 1980s, and at that time we didn't believe in sex because that might lead to dancing. Now, some people think that an affair can enhance their marriage. A guy says to his wife, "Hey, honey, I was just trying to spice up our relationship." And she said, "Well, you know we can just order takeout, right?" Woo! We live in a crazy world. Lots of external pressures out there. Seems like married people, we're just looking for an alibi, and single people, they just want to find a date. Now, some people think adultery is consequence-free. It's just between consenting adults. No one needs to know. It's my business. But we know that sometimes there are serious consequences to divorce and adultery. For one, we may have to give up on that fantasy of being a secret agent because we're probably always going to get our cover blown and we're going to get caught. And you might have to give up that really great storytelling talent you had. Remember, you used to have your friends on the edge of their seat and you could just hold them with a narrative. Well, now you're going to have to give that up because every time you tell a story, you're going to have to leave the best parts out. So, a man sitting at a bar, and in walks his past wife, his present wife, and his future wife, all at the same time. It was pretty tense. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You've been a great audience. Let's head to Q&A and go home. Wow. Okay, well, it isn't easy coming to terms with our sexual desires. A couple of reasons why that come to mind. First, it seems like it's an ongoing process that never ends. Just when it seems like we've got it figured out, we have to reevaluate things. And even many of us who are in a committed relationship, or even many of us who are married, still, of course, realize that my desires for that other thing that might be better, my desires for other people, that doesn't just go away. And we might well ask, why does God create us this way? Another thing that makes it difficult is that sometimes the voice of sexual desire is so powerful, and it sometimes speaks very loudly, almost as though it has the voice of a God and might be tempted even to make promises that we can't keep. Now, some people feel they have an easy answer to this complicated question. It's just biology. That's all sex is. That's all desire is. It's evolutionary forces at work. And it's got nothing to do with you personally. It's just physical. It's evolution's way of keeping the population of the planet going. It's just biology. Now, this is not a new idea. The Apostle Paul talks about this in Corinth, in Corinthians chapter 6. And in verse 13, there were some people, early Christians, that Paul was working with, and they were trying to figure out their newfound faith in Jesus. If Christ has paid for everything, then can I just do whatever I want? And so they had a saying that food is for the stomach, and stomach is for the food. In other words, desiring food is just a physical thing. And if I desire sex, that's just a physical need, and I should be able to get it whenever I want. And Paul says, okay, true. Food is a physical thing that we need. But sex is different. Sex is connected to our bodies, how we feel about ourselves, and our bodies are connected to Christ. And St. Paul gets it. When we're talking about adultery, divorce, sex, and desire, it's connected to all of humanity. When we talk about desire and sex, we're not just talking about physical sensations in our body. Take a moment. Let's try a little mental exercise together. Think of an object, a physical object that you really cherish or hold dear. Maybe someone gave it to you as a gift. Maybe it's a work of art, a piece of jewelry. Maybe a letter someone wrote to you. Maybe it's a wristwatch, an electronic device, a car. Think about that thing and how it looks, its colors. Maybe you can feel the weight of it in your hand. Or we think about the mechanics of how it works. But the more we think about that physical object, the more we then turn to other things, like the person who gave me that physical object, the feelings that I had when I got it, how it makes me feel when I look at it or have it right now, and all of the events and the emotions that are tied up with it. And then we realize that that physical object is actually about something else. It's about me. It's about what makes me unique. And this thing is really about that. What we do with our energies, what we do with our bodies, what we do with our sometimes ferocious appetites, what we do with trying to deal with heartbreak, and how we continually long for something else out there that's better, or we continually desire someone else. All of this is connected to our sexuality. And the more we try to come to terms with our sexuality, the more we realize it's about things beyond the physical realm. We end up coming to what's spiritual, because this is always about that. Let's read the whole passage together from Matthew. We're moving on in order here in the Sermon of the Mount. And in chapter 5, verses 27 to 32, Jesus says, "You've heard that the law says, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust in his eye has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So if your eye, even if it's your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out, throw it away. It's better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even if it's your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. It's better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. You've heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a letter of divorce. But I say, a man who divorces his wife, unless she's been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Deep breath. This is not an easy text. There's a lot of extreme language. It's life versus death. The stakes are really high. Now, before we move on, I just want to say a couple of sources that help me to deal with this passage. One is a book by Rob Bell. It's called Sex God, and it was published in 2007. And some of the ideas in this book I've kind of taken inspiration from for this talk. And another book that's helped me is C.S. Lewis' The Four Loves. This is from the 1950s. So it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. And it's also the only audio version of C.S. Lewis's voice. And of particular help for me in unraveling this talk today was the chapter on eros, which is the Greek word for desire. So I just wanted to cite my sources. To understand this challenging text, let's break it down into smaller parts. You've heard it said in verse 27, 28. Jesus says, "You've heard that the law says, do not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust in his eye has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Whew. You've heard it said. This is a recurring theme in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus wants to go beyond the captain obvious of the situation. And he wants to get to the inner heart of how we really feel and what our intentions are. He wants to go beyond the material into the spiritual. We've heard this before. You've heard it said, don't commit murder. And I say, don't even be angry with anyone or call them an idiot, because if you do, that can be just as bad, and you're in big trouble if you do that. You've heard it said, don't break your word. I say, says Jesus, don't even make a promise that you can't keep. So you've heard it said, and Jesus continues that theme. He states the obvious rules, and then he extends it in a really masterful way to get to the deeper side of what's going on. Because it's not just about what's public, what's seen. It's not just about, oh my gosh, I hope the scandal doesn't get out. It's about what's inside of us and our inner intentions. Now, the standard Jesus sets is incredibly high. Like, what? How am I supposed to do this? Like, how am I supposed to never look at something with sexual desire or another person? Like, some of us may even be thinking, I see explicit sexual imagery and I wasn't even looking for it. I just happened to see it on my phone by accident. I see it in media culture and I wasn't even looking for it. So how is it possible that I can measure up? Jesus goes on. You've heard it said in verse 31 and 32. You've heard that the law says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a divorce letter. But I say, a man who divorces his wife, unless she's been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. What Jesus is getting at here is that divorce isn't just a piece of paper. It's not just a physical thing. It goes deep into our being. And it's also about breaking promises and maybe even harming other people. Maybe Jesus was tuned into the fact that a woman in Bible times in Jesus' day was vulnerable to divorce. For example, it wasn't easy for a woman to enter into a contract. It was easier for a man to do that. And so there was a massive gender bias. A woman in Jesus' day who was divorced was much more vulnerable, and it would be harder for her to make ends meet. And so perhaps Jesus is challenging us here to think that, hey, guys, this isn't just about you and the actions that you can take. It's also about her. It's about other people. You've heard it's about this, but it's really about that. We get to some other passages in this part of Matthew that have some very challenging words. Jesus is using really extreme language to tell us how to avoid sexual sin. In verse 29 and 30, he says, "So if your eye, even if your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one eye, one part of your body, than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even if it's your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." Are these verses meant to be taken literally? Why are they so extreme? Is Jesus suggesting bodily mutilation to avoid sin? We'll step back. A few thoughts on this. We shouldn't be overly surprised by the exaggerated words. We see it in other parts of Scripture. It's often used as a literary device to catch the reader's attention. We see, for example, in the Song of Psalms, chapter 4, verse 7, one lover says to another, "Oh, you are altogether beautiful, my love. In you there is no flaw." Really? No flaw? He's perfect. She's perfect. We know it's not necessarily true. But when we're falling in love, we sure feel that way. We feel that everything is just right. And so sometimes an exaggeration is closer to the truth of how we feel in the moment. Now, we may also not want to forget that Jesus is human, and he has his own literary style. He was steeped in a very long-standing tradition of the Jewish art of writing and crafting words. And G.K. Chesterton says it well. Christ had a literary style of his own. The diction used by Christ is quite curiously gigantesque. It's full of camels leaping through needles and mountains hurling to the sea. So, should we gouge our eyes out and cut our hands off? No. Jesus is using really strong language to get our attention so we don't miss the point. But wait, there's more. The last part of chapter 32 reads, "A man who divorces his wife, unless she's been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Ooh, causes her to commit adultery? That sounds so unfair. So let's get this straight. Even if a woman is 100% innocent, she's committed adultery if she's divorced, and then anyone else who marries her has committed adultery? Really? Well, as with other verses that have exaggeration, we need to take a step back. Few thoughts on this. So let's say the woman hasn't done anything wrong. It's kind of like saying, can a woman murder without murdering? Could a woman be a thief without stealing anything? Could a woman be accused as a liar without lying? The short answer is no, she can't. What Jesus is saying here is that divorce is a separation of a sacred and holy union. It goes really, really deep into our being. This is not like being lied to by a neighbor. This is not like a friend who cancels a dinner date on you and doesn't text you to let you know. It cuts right into our soul, and it hurts both parties very deeply. Have you ever known anyone who's gone through a divorce and they said it was going well? Now, it may also be worth noting that the original translation of verse 32 is a little bit nuanced. It sounds like the woman is the doer of the action, but in the original Greek, it's just a little bit more passive. It could also be interpreted as the man makes her a victim of adultery. And some NIV translations actually do write it down this way. Jesus wants us to see the bigger picture. We can bring hell or heaven to earth right here, right now. Imagine a group of high school boys standing by their lockers. A young girl walks by, and one of the boys says, "How would you rate that?" And then some boys go on to assign numerical values to physical attributes and various parts of the girl's anatomy. It's a scenario that happens all the time. We see it everywhere. It's even become big-time entertainment culture. Have you ever been part of that group of boys? Were you tempted to join in? Have you ever been that girl? How did it make you feel when you heard those comments? This is what Jesus is talking about in these verses. Sexual desire isn't wrong. Sexual desire is to be human. But when it dehumanizes other people, that's when it takes away their humanity. Let's take another step back. In the Lord's Prayer, in Matthew chapter 6, verse 10, we've heard the often quoted part of that prayer that says, "May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And the scriptures teach us that there are two realms, heaven and earth. Both are part of the kingdom. Now, to the Jewish mind in those days, heaven was not a fixed place in a separate location somewhere out there in the future. To a person in the Jewish tradition, the kingdom of God meant everywhere, and anything that God has reign or influence over. That heaven and the kingdom is also right here. Now, some people have read these verses to mean that the consequences for lust, adultery, careless sex, divorce, is that you're going to hell, a place somewhere out there in the future with perpetual torment and suffering. And Jesus is saying, not so fast, because hell can also be right here and right now on earth. It may be also interesting to note that the two references for hell we have here in Matthew are translated as Gehenna in the original Greek, or Valley of the Wailing in Hebrew. And this was a literal place. A place called hell was a real place outside of Jerusalem. And as Jonathan had mentioned previously in our talk on anger, this place was a garbage dump. It was awful. It smelled. Things were burning. Garbage was burning. Animal bodies were burning. It was a really, really gross place. And essentially, as with anger, Jesus was saying, if you get angry at your friend, you're wasting your life. It's like you're checking yourself in to the garbage dump. What a waste. And here Jesus is saying the same thing as well, that we run the risk of checking our bodies into the dump and wasting our lives away if we don't take his advice on sexuality seriously, if we don't take his advice on divorce and commitment seriously. We don't want to feel like trash, and yet we do it to ourselves all the time. Almost exactly 80 years ago to the day, in the spring of 1945, some British troops were moving through Germany, and they had liberated a concentration camp called Bergen-Belsen. The lieutenant that day was Colonel Merson Willett Gonen, and he wrote down what he saw in that experience. He said, "I can give no adequate description of the horror camp in which my men and myself are to spend the next month of our lives. It's a barren wilderness, as bare as a chicken run. Corpses lay everywhere. Children, men, and women collapse as we walk by them. We know that 500 people a day are going to die, and this is going to go on for weeks, and we can't do anything. It's not easy to watch a child die when a nurse could have saved them. We see women drowning in their own vomit because they're too weak to turn over. There are men eating worms, holding a loaf of bread because they can't tell the difference. Piles of corpses are everywhere, naked and obscene. In a dysentery tank, I can see the remains of a child floating. It's a shocking, terrible, and awful scene. Is it bad because people shouldn't eat worms? Is this scene bad because it's poor manners to pile up dead bodies? No, this is really awful because it's anti-human. When a human being is mistreated, objectified, neglected, these actions are against God. Which takes us back to something that happened during Colonel Gonen's stay at the concentration camp. Now, the troops were helpless to do anything for a while. Their medical supplies were low. There weren't enough medical staff to help, so it was very difficult for them to watch the scene unfold. But something happened. Colonel Gonen said a few weeks later in his diary, it was shortly after the Red Cross arrived that a very large quantity of lipstick arrived. This is not what we wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and hundreds of other things, and I don't know who asked for the lipstick, but it was an act of sheer genius and unadulterated brilliance. Nothing did more than the lipstick. Women lay in bed with no sheets and no nightie, but with scarlet lips. I saw a woman dead on a post-mortem table, holding on tightly to a piece of lipstick. At last, someone had done something to make them feel like individuals again. They were someone, not just a tattoo on an arm. At last, they could take an interest in their appearance. That lipstick gave them back their humanity. Because sometimes the difference between heaven and hell is a little bit of lipstick. There's so much more we could say, of course, on this passage. Do you guys want to go to Q&A for a little bit, or should we call it a day?